Welcome to Norse Code, the #1 podcast for your Minnesota Vikings. I am your host and producer. My name is James Fagashnik. Thank you guys so much for listening. And at the other end of the tin cannon string, we have our analyst and co-host. You know him from numerous blogs and podcasts around the internet, most notably from theathletic.com. He is useful human Arif Hassan. Arif, how you doing tonight?
I'm good, man. How are you?
I am fresh back from a trip to your neck of the woods in the Uptown neighborhood. I visited many interesting places and found a pothole that was so big I swore it had a sign on it that said $10 for underground parking. My car did not enjoy the experience, and there's nothing like getting a flat in Uptown when there's like nothing.
Right.
There are no stores to help you. If you need a New York style pizza, or if you need a barcade, by God, they have those.
Multiple barcades.
Multiple.
Actually.
Yeah, Tilt was awesome. I enjoyed the hell out of Tilt. But and the wait for the tow, because I have free towing through my insurance, the wait for the tow was no less than 6 hours because all the tow trucks were busy getting all the flat tire cars off the road.
Yeah. Uptown has basically just been a slalom test, which is great because Uptown has like uniquely narrow lanes.
Oh, very. Yeah, there was nothing we could have done. Nothing at all we could have done.
It's phenomenal.
I was like, oh, this will be a fun thing I'll have to deal with all day Saturday. Yeah.
Welcome to Minneapolis, James.
I haven't been back in so thud. Oh. What was actually better, I talked to somebody about this earlier, was I haven't stayed in, I ended up staying at a hotel in Roseville just because it's just a little bit cheaper, and I didn't want to go south on 35W because that's apparently like no man's land now. And so I stayed at this hotel that used to be good, like I've stayed at before. And it is the worst hotel I have been in my entire life. It was so terrible. The moment that you open the door and like close it, the art fell off the wall. That is as close to a like Shakespearean style warning that everything in this hotel is going to be terrible.
Right. It's like almost too on the nose for a movie unless it was like a comedy.
Exactly.
Right?
If somebody hadn't been walking in the room with me at the time, no one would believe the story. Like, really? That was the first thing that happened? Be like, oh, and the shower has the water pressure of a ladybug peeing on you, and you feel just as clean afterwards too. And like but behind the hotel, the hotel like parking is bad, but like behind the hotel there is this like slope. And when I stayed there before, it was the fall, so there wasn't like snow and water out there. It wasn't a lake, but there's this like little slope behind the hotel where the rest of the parking goes, and that is apparently where all of the snow and rain and ice has collected. So there was like an ice bog behind the hotel you had to ford in order to get through, in order to get to the additional parking. So like, whereas where I'm from, you have to like say a little promise to God every time you go into an unmarked intersection because the snow piles are so high. Here, you said your prayer before you entered the ice bog. And there's floating chunks, like there's actual, it felt like you were going through the Atlantic. Like there were actual icebergs, like big chunks of ice floating in there that would go over the hood of your car if you went too fast. And I'm just like, really? Everything about this hotel is a goddamn disaster.
That's incredible.
It was... Yeah, 2 out of 10. I would consider staying there again. The price was right, but everything else was terrible. So, I mean, if you ignore that aspect of it, but I did somehow end up surviving thanks to a Tires Plus and a lot of churches I'm going to end up having to build in the next few years. So, welcome to Norse Code. We have lots of stuff to talk about. There are arrivals and departures that we're going to need to talk about now that free agency has opened. We can spend a moment laughing at the Raiders and Well, less the Raiders and more the Giants. I'm not entirely sure what that GM is trying to do, but it's so entertaining watching him do it. We have plenty of stuff with the Vikings, and we have a great mailbag. But before we start, just want to thank you guys so much for donating to the show, for listening, for helping us along. We have really enjoyed you guys, and hope to have you guys around for a little longer. We will be doing some more fun stuff for the Patreon people. We'll likely have a fun episode next for April Fools. I'm still trying to come up with a decent idea, but I may have something. So we'll see how that ends up going. But if you hear value in the product that we put out, if you enjoy the show, feel free to throw us a couple bucks at patreon.com/Norse Code, which is a subscription-based service, or you can go to paypal.me/Norse Code, and you can throw $1 there, Tree Fitty to help keep the Locked On sponsor at bay, whatever you'd like to do. We are an ad-free service, and we hope you guys enjoy that. So if you enjoy it and want to help support the show, just toss a buck or two in the tip jar, and we will continue to be ad-free and just as lovely as possible. So the big news out of the last 2 weeks, as far as the Vikings are concerned, seems to be the signing, disappearance, and reemergence of Anthony Barr. And it was an interesting re-signing because A, it had been reported that he had signed with the Jets, but also B, this is a bit of a polarizing thing because there are fans who really believe that Anthony Barr should have gone away, that he didn't earn the contract that he's about to get. Exactly. But he's back and will be playing with the Vikings this year. You've been on Twitter and defending Anthony Barr, which has surprised some, but it shouldn't surprise listeners of the show. What was your take on the Anthony Barr signing and how it was, kind of how it went down?
Yeah, well, so first it's like bizarre, right? Like you mentioned that the whole story of him committing to signing with the Jets and then backing out is like crazy. And then, of course, he earns like a bunch of enemies in New York by saying stuff like, I felt physically ill after I had agreed to sign with the Jets. Monday was the worst day of my life, that sort of stuff. It didn't make a ton of fans with Jets, loyal, but it was pretty incredible. The idea that him coming back to the Vikings for seems like a much smaller contract, I think $1.5 million less per year, is interesting and kind of bizarre to me. There is a sack escalator in his contract, and I don't really know why, because his job is to essentially, from a pass protection or a pass rushing standpoint, his job is to make it easier for other people to do their jobs. And obviously he has to, generate pressure and earn sacks in order to do that. But, his ability to force one-on-one protection instead of area slide protection really kind of enables, Linval Joseph to see one-on-one instead of 2-on-1. It allows, whoever the 3 technique is last year, Sheldon Richardson, to attack the B gap really well. His job is to make sure that there can be no double teams along the offensive line. That doesn't mean he himself gets sacks. So I don't know if it would be kind of interesting if the sack escalator in his contract was for team sacks instead of individual sacks. I haven't seen, and we're not going to get a copy of the contract or anything like that, but I haven't seen anything to one effect or the other. But usually when a player has a sack incentive in the contract, it's for their individual sack production. So some people seem to think that this is an indication that it'll be used much more often as a pass rusher. I don't see it. I mean, he already rushes the passer more than every other off-ball linebacker, and that's 100 pass rushes a year. And given that they see about 650 passing snaps, that's kind of surprising, and especially given that he didn't play all the snaps this year. So he had maybe closer to 500 passing snaps, and he rushed on 100 of those. So he rushed on only about 20%. He threatened to rush on probably another 25 to 30%. And that has that kind of intended effect too, forcing one-on-one protection. But that means about the other 50% of the time or so, he's, dropping back in coverage. And, not a lot of people think that he's particularly good at that, which I don't think that's really fair. There was a discussion that I had, or rather, actually, I participated. And no one actually really replied to me. But that
you were
Sam
just
Monson
shouting. You're just shouting out loud.
Yeah, right. Which I mean, I do a lot.
Yeah.
But yeah, Sam Monson, Pro Football Focus, Nick Olson, just at Nick Olson NFL, I think. They were talking about his coverage and there was, PFF was like, hey, if you're not asking him to rush the passer, you're not asking him to do a bunch of stuff that's very good. Nick Olson responds with, hey, he had like the third best snaps per yard in coverage of all linebackers. And that includes this like awful game against Los Angeles where he gave up like over 100 yards. What gives? And Sam responds with, a pretty good argument that his responsibilities weren't nearly as tough and that Los Angeles attacked Anthony Barr because they knew he was weak, which I think is, I don't want to say disingenuous because I don't think Sam is like lying to make a point or anything like that, but I think it's mischaracterizing kind of what happened in that game, and I'll get to that in a second. But Eric Kendricks tends to have more difficult assignments for a little bit further down the field. And he didn't execute them very well this last year. But, the fact that he's given those assignments speaks to what the Vikings think of his overall coverage ability, which has been pretty good over the past 4 years. But, Anthony Barr, a lot of times he's buzzing to the flats. And I think it's kind of unfair to knock him for that because that's the point, is that the most common response to pressure up the middle, especially a double-A gap blitz, but in particular a blitzing linebacker, is to throw a screen pass. Most often against a blitz, you throw into the blitz because you've got, a coverage defender leaving an area in coverage, and that leaves that area open. And so a lot of times that can be slant passes. A lot of times that can be screen passes. Well, if you've got somebody who has the ability to move from the A gap to the flat extraordinarily quickly and beat running backs to the flat, then you've got your answer to the most common response to the double-A gap blitz, and most teams don't have that response on their defense. They just don't have the players who are physically capable of doing that. And so to knock Barr for doing that when he's actually playing a really vital role in taking away the top couple of answers that people have to a blitz and making that third down defense as consistently good as it has been, I think that kind of just ignores the way the defense is designed. So I'll say that, and Barr has actually been pretty decent in coverage when he's been dropping into, those curl hook zones that are traditional areas where linebackers drop to. Linebackers should not be covering wide receivers 60, 70 yards down the field, and I'm not going to hold those against him. But they do often find themselves matched up against receivers in coverage when, especially they're in zone and those receivers are running like mesh or crossing patterns, and they didn't attack Anthony Barr that often in those situations. And so I think it's kind of misleading to say that that's, that the Rams identified a weakness in Anthony Barr and they attacked it, when really what had happened was the Rams identified a weakness in the way the coverage was being run for the Vikings and how the Vikings would adjust their coverages in response to motion. And it just so happened that Barr was the overhang defender in those situations instead of Kendricks. And that meant that Barr was the one lined up on a linebacker instead of Kendricks, because Kendricks is a middle linebacker in cover two and is covering the weak side is the middle linebacker in base, is covering the weak side in nickel. And so he's not going to end up a lot of times after motion covering the wide receiver. So they attacked the fact that a linebacker would be covering a receiver. Kendricks can't chase Cooper Kupp 60 yards down the field either. He doesn't have the ability to run stride for stride with Robert Woods. So the idea that they were attacking Anthony Barr, I think, is kind of ridiculous. And then, of course, after the coverage change, which is not a result of Anthony Barr being bad, but the coverage change was a product of A, miscommunication along the defense, generally speaking, and B, the fact that teams have just become so comfortable attacking cover three Anthony Barr ended up being really good in coverage. And even after you include that game, his coverage numbers are really remarkable. And even after you account for the difficulty of all that stuff, he hasn't been bad in coverage. He's been a good pass rusher, and he's been, decent against the run. I think some people pointed to like the fact that he only has 70 tackles or something like that. And that too misunderstands kind of what Barr does, because it's very similar to what traditionally, 5-7 years ago, a middle linebacker does. They would follow the fullback, attack the fullback, squeeze the lane, and make it difficult for the running back to attack the gap on either side of the fullback. And it would free up your weak side linebacker, someone like a Levante David or Chad Greenway, who I know was a Sam with the Vikings, but actually was a weak side linebacker. It would free up someone like Greenway to attack the running back without blockers. And so those linebackers that attack freely, that don't have to worry about, the fullback or the pulling guard as often, they tend to have higher tackle totals. Now, Barr's tackle totals are still a little bit lower after you account for the types of linebackers that have his responsibilities. But I think that he has demonstrated overall that he does a pretty good job of squeezing those lanes, attacking blockers, and generating tackles for loss when he can. So he's played at a really high level this last year. I wouldn't say he deserved the Pro Bowl spot that he got, but he certainly played well above that of an average linebacker, an off-ball linebacker. And then beyond that, in terms of the money that the Vikings paid, I've said before, I think that they did slightly overpay him. Not by a ton, though. And so overall, I think, it makes sense for the Vikings. And his type of ability is fairly scarce. Devin Bush or Devin White maybe in this draft could have done it. But it seems increasingly unlikely that they'll fall to where the Vikings are. I've seen one of those linebackers drafted to 5 in Tampa Bay in a couple of mocks. I've seen almost every mock draft one of those 2 linebackers at 11 to the Cincinnati Bengals. And then there's a really good chance that the Pittsburgh Steelers want to trade up and jump the Vikings, so the Steelers are at 20, jump the Vikings at 18 and grab one of those 2 linebackers too. So, and then, you've got all of those people in between that might or might not want a linebacker. So it seems increasingly unlikely that they'll be able to draft a linebacker with those physical capabilities. So I understand it. I think that I would have walked away at the price being over 12.5 million. And I would have been pretty ticked off about, my ability to try and replace him. But I think it makes sense as a deal, and that the Vikings put themselves in a pretty good position at that spot. So obviously they have to resolve these other cap things. I wouldn't be surprised if Trey Waynes was actually traded. My guess is that there's a couple of things holding that up. Like, for example, one of the potential trade partners might be the Chiefs. They just signed a cornerback. They just had this thing with Tyreek Hill pop up that might implicate him in child abuse. So they might need to replace him in the draft, which is obviously very difficult, but it also means that they wouldn't be able to part with, one of their second rounders. And if the Vikings are asking for a second rounder, which I think they are, then that eliminates one of the trade partners. And, there could be other trade partners. You could potentially ask the Raiders, or you could ask the Colts or whatever. And I think the Colts would make a lot of sense too. But it is difficult, right? So, that I think is going to end up happening. That'll free up cap space, and they'll be able to, sign potentially Josh Klein, who they've got on a visit, but probably don't have the money for yet, and so on. So I think that, those are my thoughts on Anthony Barr with regards to the signing and his role in the defense, and the reason why the defense is as effective as it is without him generating, 100 plus tackles.
Well, and there have been criticisms of Anthony Barr, some fair and some unfair, about things like it seems like he takes either plays off or entire games off. Last year was not a 100% this is the best Anthony Barr we've ever seen thing. That was probably 2 years ago, maybe even last year, but the year before. But it does seem like that this is an awful lot of money for somebody who did have a couple of borderline terrible games this year.
Yeah, well, so in terms of his bad games this year, I think there was only 2. One of them is the Rams game, and I think that's fairly well explained by, his coverage, which is not to say he did really well outside of those big plays. I mean, would have been nice to see him cover Todd Gurley in the red zone. There's a good explanation. It's that Todd Gurley always runs an angle route, and this time he didn't. But, the fact that there's an explanation doesn't excuse him in the same way, but it gives you a little bit of understanding and context. Then the Chicago game, week 17, I mean, Anthony Barr really shit the bed in that game. I
was going to bring up Buffalo, but I feel like Buffalo is the outlier in all of it that gets removed.
That one is so weird because he didn't play badly from the traditional markers of play that you're how did he do in coverage? Pretty well. How did he do against the run? Actually, pretty well. How did he do as a pass rusher? Pretty well. Oh, well, then he had a good game. Well, not really.
Nah.
The horse collar penalty, that's pretty bad. The getting run over by Josh Allen, that's not ideal.
Yeah, that's one that's going to burn on your memory for a bit.
Yeah, I think people are also attributing some things to him in that game that weren't his fault, like the two huge miscommunications on Josh Allen's scrambles. One, I think, was a screen miscommunication. One was a deep miscommunication. That was a problem between whoever the nickel corner was at the time, and I think it was a different nickel corner in both of those plays, and Eric Kendricks. And good chance that means it's probably on the nickel corner. But that was a miscommunication between a nickel corner and the other linebacker, not Anthony Barr. But yeah, I mean that's a weird game to get into for him. I mean, Chicago, he just played poorly. The Rams game we talked about a little bit. In terms of him taking plays off and stuff like that, this is a thing that mostly comes up because Mike Zimmer said something at the end in December of 2016 about Anthony Barr coasting. This is something that I think Zimmer would actually take back at this point, just because of how much of a thing it's become. But it was only about the 2016 season. And a lot of people have talked about it as if it's been a persistent problem since then, and it really hasn't been. And in fact, people have asked Zimmer if, that's and it's not. So I don't really. I think it's a thing that people think about him from now until the end of time, even though it was about a couple of games of the 2016 season. And I don't know if that's fair either, because I don't want to I like it when coaches are candid, but I feel like a lot of times Zimmer's criticisms of players can miss the mark. And obviously the Sharif Floyd example is the example. It's the one that you can point to. But he said this about a lot of players. I mean, he said this about Josh Robinson, saying you can't make the club in the tub. And Robinson, for all his faults, and of course I've defended Robinson on this podcast before, so maybe I'm not the person to talk about this, but I've never thought that he's a guy that isn't willing to do the dirty work, or that he's a guy that would fake an injury, or anything like that. I've never thought that, he's been lazy about what he's doing and stuff like that. And the fact that he had a really good year in his final year with the Vikings until the Chicago game, and then it just got in his head and he'd just been bad for the second half of the year, speaks to, his effort and his ability to work. And I just feel like sometimes coaches will criticize players for effort when sometimes that's not even the thing, but it's very difficult to find another thing to criticize. So I don't even know if effort's an actual problem with Anthony Barr. And if it was in the past years ago. So yeah, it's not an issue. And plus, if it was an issue, he wouldn't, he's got the green dot, first of all. Second, the Vikings wouldn't have lobbied so hard to bring him back. And then, which I think should guide a lot of our thoughts on Anthony Barr, is that the Vikings wanted to bring him back, and that's not a way to mute all criticism. I mean, the Vikings have brought back a lot of offensive linemen that I've been very critical of, but I think it should guide our thoughts on stuff, especially that we have no information on, like how he is in the locker room, and stuff like that. And I believe, along with Everson Griffin, Anthony Barr was a captain this year. And so that seems pretty unlikely that he would be a captain if he was still lazy and stuff.
Or, if somebody thought of him as some sort of a locker room cancer or something like that. So
right. Yeah. So yeah, my thoughts on Anthony Barr, not condensed, but there you are.
Well, let's go to the Everson Griffin restructure. We'll call that a bit of an arrival here. Everson Griffin is restructuring, taking less money, and the thought was that he was probably going to end up being let go, or popular opinion, if you were to be following Vikings Twitter, which you shouldn't be, would be that Everson Griffin was probably going to end up going away.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that was mostly just driven by the fact that he hadn't signed a restructure, and we were getting to the wire, and we'd already passed, I think, the league deadline, but not the deadline in his contract, which guarantees his contract on Friday, or on the Friday after the league year opened. And so it became increasingly likely, it felt like, that Griffin wasn't going to sign or restructure. But, he did. He freed up, like $6 million in cap space. Or something like that. And that brought the Vikings up to $7.2 million. So, yeah, that's great. I think that he's going to produce next year. He had a good first couple of games. The first 3 games with the Vikings last year, he did well. And then, of course, he had this mental health episode. And after he came back from that episode, it didn't seem like he had it all back. But there were 2 or 3 games where actually he was playing very, very well. The first game back, obviously not. But even in the second game back, which was it against the Lions? Maybe that doesn't count. But he did really well. So I think that he's still got the juice to play really well. And, it sounds like he's got a support system in place now. So yeah, I think it's great. And the flip side of that is that while I think that Stephen Weatherly and Tashawn Bauer are really, really good backups that the Vikings basically didn't have to pay that much for, like an undrafted free agent and a 6th or 7th round pick. I think that they're not high quality starters. They're very high quality backups. And so I would have been uncomfortable seeing, Everson Griffin go, just because I thought, they didn't really have the pass rush there. So that was nice that they've got that for another year, and then they can invest like another mid or late round pick and some super athletic edge rusher that's going to turn into a starter, like they always seem to. So yeah, they've got another year or 2 of stability at that position. All right.
Hooray. 3, 2, 1. Next one we'll talk about is Shamar Stephen, rather. He has re-signed.
Yeah, I think in terms of like average value, the Vikings are overpaying. I think in terms of cap space this year, it's great to have him at $2.3 million in cap space. But it's like not a big deal, right? Because it was the average, like something like $3 million. So his cap space, his cap liability in 2020 and 2021 will be, $4 million, which is, not big. But yeah, I think it's overpaying for him. He is a fine swing backup, more as a backup nose tackle and a backup 3 technique. But he does that. And so that's nice because the Vikings do need a little bit of competition and depth there. What would be really cool is to see someone like Jalen Holmes or Jaleel Johnson, which seems kind of unlikely at this point, or Afadi Odenigbo, who's on the practice squad, signed a futures contract with the Vikings, really compete for that 3 technique spot if the Vikings don't draft, a 3 technique in the first 3 days of the draft, or first day or 2 of the draft, so first 3 rounds of the draft. Then that would make for like an interesting competition at the 3 technique spot. I don't think Shamar Stephen is that guy, but he's good to have on a roster because A, obviously he knows the defense, but B, he provides swing backup potential in the same way that Jaleel Johnson does.
I suppose the next thing we should talk about is Amir Abdullah signing back with the Vikings.
Yeah, I was actually a little surprised by this. I guess I shouldn't be, because it's like, the Vikings suddenly have 2 holes at running back and not 1, which we'll talk about in a second, I guess. But they don't have a kick returner You could suppose it would be Mike Hughes, but, maybe Hughes has an opportunity to start, especially if, they do end up trading Waynes. So in that case, you don't want him returning kicks. So you've got, Amir Abdullah, who can compete with Marcus Sherrills for a kick return spot. And that's good to have. His ability to compete as a back. I mean, he's not like a bad running back, but I mean, like the one thing you don't want your backup running backs to do is like fumble. And that's just been a persistent issue with him. So that I think is kind of the one thing that would kind of concern me if he ends up being a primary backup running back. But for the most part, I mean, he's got, a pretty decent skill set as a running back. He can catch the ball. I don't think he's got as much potential as Mike Boone, but mostly because we know that Mike Boone is a super athlete and Amir Abdullah is merely like a pretty good athlete. And then B, we know the first couple of years of Amir Abdullah's career. We have that information. So it's very easy to say that somebody we have no information about has more potential. So that's there. And I think Boone is probably a better route runner at this point, despite Abdullah's experience. And so I think Boone might end up being more valuable as a running back.
And of course, Dan Bailey has re-signed. The max for his contract is $2 million. I believe he's looking at $1 million with his incentives this year.
Yeah, I'm curious about what those incentives are. Like, is it points? Because like the CBA limits you in the types of incentives you can actually put into a contract. So it's not like game-winning field goals can be an incentive. It's not allowed by the CBA. So I don't know. Is it points? Is it field goal percentage? Maybe that's an allowable incentive. Sure, man. I don't know. I think it's a good signing.
Just put it on XPs. Just.
Yeah, right.
If you miss one extra point for the season,
it's $1 million. That's it.
Yeah, exactly. It's just $1 million straight up. Like Vikings fans will just come up and give you $1. I gives them $1.
But yeah, I think it's a good signing. I wrote an article saying that we should expect him to regress positively. I think I wrote it in like week 14 or 13. And then he didn't miss a kick after that. So you're welcome, Vikings fans.
When things go right, and I predicted it, it's because of me.
Yeah.
Not
when
the
things
player.
go wrong, it's Lady Luck cursing me.
Yes.
Nothing to do with me.
Nothing. It's the sword of Damocles. I can't do a thing about it. It's just always hanging there.
Right. But yeah, I expect him to be a top 7 kicker. I mean, honestly, I wanted to say top 5, but I'm a coward, so I said top 7. Still pretty bold, I think.
Well, considering the Vikings' history with kickers, yes. Let's talk about some departures, and the first one I want to bring up is kind of a newer departure that just happened. Andrew Sendejo is going to be an Eagle.
Yeah, I saw someone like respond to the Eagles announcement with, he's a dirty player, he'll fit right in. Which, like, A, did they think that like 4 months ago? But B, I mean, I really dislike the Eagles fan base, and one Eagle in particular. I don't know that I've ever really heard that the Eagles are like dirty.
No. This is not a situation of like the 2009 Saints where you looked at their play and went, no, they're dirty as hell. No,
right,
this isn't the team as a team that they have dirty players or anything, or the reputation that the Bengals have had over the last few years.
Right.
And Burfict, I believe it was Burfict going over the Raiders just makes me laugh and laugh and laugh. And laugh.
Yeah.
But no, it's nothing like that.
Yeah, it's just like, yeah, okay, I get it. Fuck the Eagles, fine, totally on board. Not really like shooting for accuracy with that criticism, huh? But yeah, I talked to Eagles writers, and I was like, so he would only be like a third string safety there, right? Because they've got Avonte Maddox, they have Crap, I wanted to say Dawkins. He hasn't been an Eagle for like 2 decades. Malcolm Jenkins.
You
yeah,
wanted
that's
it.
Close.
You wanted it. He did just go in the Hall of Fame, so.
Right, yeah. This is on my mind. It's totally reasonable and understandable. Don't worry about it. No, they've got Malcolm Jenkins, who's pretty good. So, yeah, he wouldn't start. And they were like, yeah, absolutely, he's a third safety. And I was like, well, I don't get it. Like, if he just like, were the Vikings just not interested in him being a third safety? Because he's a starting quality safety. He's gotten better every single year, and he's now proven that he can play both free safety and box safety at a reasonable level, right? Like, he's an above average starting quality safety. So he should be starting somewhere. But yeah, I guess not. Cool. I mean, I didn't really like Sendeo as like a person. He's always kind of a jerk in the locker room. He never talked to media, which isn't by itself, jerkish, I guess. But if you want to like, if you're trying to like make him look good, and you're like, oh, hey, can I figure out what happened on this play where you got an interception? He's like, absolutely not. Like, okay, I'm trying to help you at this point, man. Come on.
Let me write a fluff piece about you, damn it. Right.
And it's just like, dude. And, the Make Football Violent Again hat, like, he was just built to be contentious. So, it is now slightly easier to, like, hate the Eagles. Not really, but, whatever works.
Aw. All right. So the next person we can talk about is Tom Compton, who was actually signed by the Jets. If Compton went to the Jets and signed, or like was given a good offer and then signed for less with the Vikings, I think that would have been 4 in 2 years that had looked at the Jets, looked at the Vikings, and went, no, I'm going to go with the Vikings. So, because I think it was Kirk Cousins, it was Anthony Barr. I think Sherrills was in there too.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Did
Sherrills was offered money by the Jets. I believe it was it was last year, and decided that he'd be staying with the Vikings, or Amazing. It might have been 2 years ago. Yeah, but Sherrills was involved in that. So if Tom Compton would have also said no, that would have been hilarious and just one more reason for the
incredible
for fun with the with the Jets. But Tom Compton is now a Jet.
I thought Compton actually played pretty well for the first 6 games of the year, minus the game against the Rams where Aaron Donald just wrecked him. Which, I mean, on one hand, it's like, it's Aaron Donald. But on the other hand, it's like, most people did actually end up playing better against Aaron Donald than he did. So, who knows? But, he was all right. And then he got injured, and then he came back, and he was awful. So honestly, it would have been nice for the Vikings to retain him. And I was a huge critic of Tom Compton. I thought he had a terrible training camp. He got beat up all the time in training camp, admittedly by like Sheldon Richardson, but he had a bad training camp, and he actually had a bad preseason in my estimation too. So for him to have like a reasonable first set of games was surprising, but obviously like that's what matters. It's not, no one cares if you're actually bad in training camp if you're good in games. So it would have been nice for him to come back, because maybe he would have recovered from the injury and played pretty well. So kind of sucks. The Vikings have like one guard on their roster, so that's going to need to be fixed. But yeah, Compton has been pretty bad for most of his career, so it's not like I expect him to start playing at like a Pro Bowl level for the Jets. But I think this is secretly like an all right signing by the Jets.
And Sheldon Richardson went over to the Browns, which surprised some, but I think it was more just a surprise on the Browns.
Yeah, I mean, the Browns are accumulating talent on both sides of the ball. I'm going to watch the hell out of the Browns next year, man. It's going to be fun.
That's going to be a really interesting, that's going to be a real interesting team to kind of bandwagon on just a little bit, especially with Odell Beckham, of all people.
Right. Yeah. Swag levels through the roof. Sheldon's going to be great there. I think he signed for like $13 million. That's higher than I would have guessed, but he's a really good defensive tackle that is coming off of a good, if inconsistent, year with the Vikings. He made, I want to say, $8 million with the Vikings last year, and so I would have offered him 10, and that was my guess at what his market was going to be. But I guess the Browns had a little bit of extra cap room, plus they really wanted to get this done. And they knew that they weren't going to target a defensive tackle in the draft, whereas the Vikings, they don't know whether or not they're going to do that. So, and I guess the Vikings probably could have offered him not $13 million, but probably could have offered him something like $9 million. And then obviously, you've got the Everson Griffin restructure and all that. And then, lose out on grabbing Shamar Stephen and kept him. But my guess is the Vikings probably offered him less than even that. And so, he goes to a place that offers him quite a bit of money and a place that I think he'll do well because, they've got, Myles Garrett there. So they'll do all right.
True or false? The Vikings could have had Sheldon Richardson or Anthony Barr, but they could not have had both.
I thought true, but now I think false. If only, but that means that they don't get, Shamar Stephen on a $3 million a year deal and stuff like that. Like if you free up Shamar Stephen and restructure Everson Griffin, and you probably just replace Amir Abdullah in the draft and stuff like that. Like get $500,000 here and $500,000 there and $3 million there. You have enough space for him, so maybe you could have. But it's tough and probably a bad idea.
Love to see the magic that would have to be involved in making that deal actually work. Be like,
probably a big signing bonus and not a ton in first-year guaranteed money.
Yeah. Be like, wow, this is the largest signing bonus in the history of signing bonuses.
Yeah, exactly.
That's amazing. Nick Easton is going to the Saints, replacing, I believe, Max Unger, who's retiring their center. Is that right?
Yeah. Max Unger, I guess he waived/retired, just hit the transaction report, and that's how everybody found out. Like, he told the Saints a couple of days after free agency opened, I'm retiring. They process his retirement in the NFL transaction waiver wire. And that's how everyone finds out. And then Nick Easton gets like $6 million a year.
Yeah, some people go to Kilimanjaro to retire. Other people, you do it through the waiver wire, apparently.
Yeah. The Kilimanjaro retirement, though, boss.
Oh, yeah. That's so much better than retiring in the middle of a game.
It's almost the exact opposite. Like literally retiring on top.
Like, well, in the off season, I decided to do mountain climbing, and while I was up here,
right, yeah,
while being the highest NFL player outside of Ricky Williams, I just wanted to take a moment to. That might have been a bad pun. Apologies.
Nah, it's what the show's about. But yeah, Nick Easton, $6 million, too much, I think. He's not, like, good, I think. And I think there was, like, this weird, I don't want to say, like, myth of Nick Easton, because that, like, oversells it, but this weird understanding for a while that Nick Easton was good and that if he re-signed with the Vikings, that'd be great. And I'm, like, not confident about that, and I've never been a Nick Easton fan. What's interesting to me is, and so I said this, I think, 2 years before last year's draft. I said, with Joe Berger retiring, that means the Vikings have two holes at guard because Nick Easton is not a starting quality guard. And so they need to draft, a guard maybe early in the draft and a guard in the middle of the draft, which, of course, that didn't happen. And so that's just a position I've held for a long time, that he just needs to be replaced. Now it's like clear that he needs to be replaced as opposed to like, well, we have him, so we might as well use him, right? But what's weird to me is how after he signed with the Saints, a bunch of people started talking about how bad he was, which, again, they're not wrong, and I genuinely believe that a lot of them hold that opinion, but it was like unusual because I didn't see a bunch of people saying that beforehand. And I guess in defense of them, I also did not talk vociferously about how bad Nick Easton was. So he signed to the Saints. Everybody says he's bad now. Great. We're all on the same page now. but the Vikings have one guard. So he's athletic and gritty and like not good. So we'll see how that works out.
Yeah. Next one. Latavius Murray, who has said that he was leaving the Vikings because he wanted to have a starting role somewhere, is now at the Saints where he will not be starting.
Yeah, I guess like it's a more defined role because he's just going to be Mark Ingram, which Mark Ingram keeps getting 1,000 yards despite not starting for the Saints, or kept getting 1,000 yards. So maybe that's just what he's looking for. Maybe not like a starting job, but like being an actual member of a running back committee as opposed to like a lip service member of the Vikings running back committee headed by Dalvin Cook. Like, I get it. He's a good guy too. So sucks that he signed at the Saints. There's like a lot of people at the Saints that I kind of like, which sucks. Like obviously Teddy, Latavius, I like him. Michael Thomas, like, good Lord.
There's enough players on that team to make you question whether or not you're the problem in this relationship.
Like, why do all my exes hate me? Right.
Am I really the only reoccurring thread in any of these? No, it's the children that are wrong.
Yeah, right, yeah.
That's what's going on here. Mike Remmers has been released. He's visiting places, but has not actually been picked up by anybody. And Rock Thomas, I'm going to call this a departure.
People have visited him.
Well, yeah,
people with badges.
Yeah, people with badges have visited Rock Thomas and arrested him for having a whole lot of pot. And I believe it was wax too, which the wax is going to turn into a much bigger thing than the actual amount of pot that he had on him. He had on him a Latroy Guion amount of marijuana. Just an unfortunate amount. No cash this time though, so he didn't go full Latroy Guion.
You're right, yeah.
That's how you go full Latroy Guion, is just have, your entire year's salary in cash with you while you have like 3 pounds of pot. So Rock Thomas likely not going to be an option for several games, if not the entire year next year.
Right.
Which is too bad. Rock Thomas did a pretty good job. He was a fine running back for the Vikings for the position that he was put into. But boy, that's rough. Yeah, he will likely not be playing for the Vikings this year. But the bigger theme that seemed to happen throughout free agency, and maybe this is just because of all the calls for offensive linemen throughout the offseason and going now into the draft, is that while the Vikings had several visits with offensive linemen, no offensive linemen ended up signing that were free agents. And so it looks like we're going to end up going through the draft for this. But it seems like the bigger thing is just that we had so many people come through and no one wanted to sign. Is this a situation of just lack of cap space, or is there some underlying factor?
I would say that, a lot of those people were like Vikings, right? And so like Nick Easton's one of them, Tom Compton's another one. And my guess is they just got more money elsewhere. Plus, Nick Easton's like negotiating position got like way better after Will Unger retired. And so, or Max Unger retired, Will Unger. After Max Unger retired. And so he could just be like, oh, you need a starting center. Well, pay me.
I can do that job for money.
Yeah. I think that some of that just has to do with the fact that the Vikings didn't have a negotiating position that allowed them to offer starting money. Now, in what you might characterize as the third or fourth wave of free agency, they're hosting Josh Klein, former Titans guard, coming off of a bad year, but he's had a pretty good career. So we'll kind of see where that goes. But the Vikings just don't have money. And so I think that that's part of it. Otherwise, yeah, they'll probably pursue a resolution of this through the draft. And I wouldn't be surprised if they drafted like a tackle/guard, maybe like, not Jonah Williams. He's probably not going to fall, but like a Dalton Risner, and then also just a pure guard later in the draft and have kind of a long-term resolution at the position instead. But yeah, I think it's just they didn't have enough money.
So this is clearly Kirk Cousins' fault, and it's Kirk Cousins' fault that he has no like skilled protection around him next year, right?
Yeah, sure. Let's. Yeah, the cap is complicated and complex, and team salaries are difficult to figure out. But I mean, it's Kirk Cousins' fault.
If he was a better quarterback, we wouldn't have this problem, right?
Right. Yeah. If he just quarterbacked his way into more cap space,
that's a thing, right? Like. It's worked for the Lions over the years. I mean, look at all the talent they've had at wide receiver while paying Matt Stafford like what 20% of their cap, 12% of their cap, something crazy.
Yeah, I mean he quarterbacked his way into more cap space.
Exactly. This is a thing. Although I was reading, unrelated to cap space, I suppose, I was reading something from Bears sports writers who were trying to convince people that Ndamukong Suh needed to sign with the Bears. Be like, I know he would be the third string behind and not even actually starting, but can you imagine? Like, boy,
sure.
The amount of Kool-Aid that is there for that Bears defense. It's a good defense. Don't get me wrong, but that is a cap hit that
yeah.
you feel dirty after. You feel about as dirty after signing Sue as you do that shower in Roseville. So just don't do it. That's my one piece of advice here.
I will say this about the Bears defense before we move on to the next thing on our agenda. I was on a podcast, What Would Sashi Do? With Kevin Cole, who it's basically an analytics podcast, but he's also a Browns fan, I think. I'm pretty sure. Hopefully I didn't malign you, Kevin. But I'll post the link to that in the show notes. But one thing that came up was this question about why does it seem like the Vikings defense can maintain its level of high play while other defenses fall off, because defenses are notoriously unreliable from year to year. And, I posited that one reason might be because they don't have to worry about, their defensive coordinator leaving, because A, their actual defensive coordinator, George Edwards, has not been interviewed for like any jobs. But B, the actual defensive coordinator is the head coach, so you don't have to worry about him leaving. Whereas other defensive coordinators are good and then they leave. And so, he said that apparently there's this piece that says that very thing. That's a big part of the reason that defenses regress is that, the tactically, the reason that they can be good is because the coordinator, Vic Fangio left. He's the head coach of the Chicago Bears, and their defensive backs coach left too. Plus, the Bears defense was pretty healthy. They lost like a nickel corner and I think one other player. But for the most part, they were pretty healthy. Plus, they led the league in turnovers. That's a great way to regress the next year. Same thing happened to the Jaguars. So pretty good idea to bet on the idea that the Bears defense will regress. So let's put that out there into the ether. I've said it a couple of times. I want to say it again. Bears defense is not going to be as good next year.
Well, that's not going to get anyone in trouble at all, or will it?
I can't see this coming back to bite me.
This will be just fine. I wanted to take a moment to talk about a piece that you did for The Athletic that maybe it's not necessarily the piece itself that's gotten the attention, more the use of simulation as far as the mock drafts are concerned. Because there are hundreds and hundreds of mock drafts out there, and it seems like people are getting really up in arms about the differences between using a full simulation and not using one. And obviously, your piece used one, so I wanted to kind of get your opinion on this oddly specific problem that Draft Twitter has.
Yeah, I don't get it. Like, what the issue with the simulation is. Like, first of all, no mock draft is like correct, which doesn't mean that you shouldn't strive for accuracy, because the whole point of a mock draft is that this is like a representation of a thing that could happen. But the things that are incorrect about the simulation or the simulation. So the one that like kicked things off was a simulation from the Draft Network, the draftnetwork.com. It's very clean. website, really great app, and I recommend it. It's a lot of fun. I used Fanspeak because I have the ability to use trades in that. But both of them are pretty great. And the thing about that is that in this specific case, it looked like a Chiefs mock had Rock Ya-Sin, a Temple cornerback, which just a great name, by the way. A Temple cornerback fall to the late third round or something like that. And so they drafted him, which fantastic. Good job for them. I don't see the issue with that. This happens like all the time. Like, and the thing where it happened, or the controversy that came about was a result of like Matt Miller talking about simulations not being accurate because you're just not going to find a top 32 player at the end of the third round. And I just thought that was really unfair. And I don't want to like put Matt on blast too much for that. But if you took a look at top 32 rankings and looked to see where players fell, you could take a look at Miller's top 32 rankings. And at the end, he had Malik Jefferson like 28, and he had another player, Sam Hubbard, like 30 or something like that. And they ended up falling to the middle of the third round, both of them drafted by the Bengals at 77 and 78. But even more, and this is something I didn't bring up, so I tweeted that, but even more, if you take a look at post-combine rankings, because we're only like 7 days, or we're a week after the combine, if you take a look at his like March 12th rankings from last year, you see someone like Maurice Hurst, number 30, right? And he falls all the way to like 145 or something like that, somewhere to the Raiders. And the Raiders ended up grabbing a bunch of people who were ranked highly on Miller's board right after the combine into the third, fourth, and fifth rounds. These are things that happen, and sometimes it's one team that tries to take advantage of it instead of, having it dispersed. And you can't predict which player it's going to be, right? We knew about Maurice Hurst's heart condition beforehand, but we didn't know kind of how serious it was or how seriously teams were treating it until I think late into the process. But the same thing happened to Andrew Billings, who fell all the way to, I think, pick 120. He was in a bunch of top 32s. And the Bengals grabbed him because the Bengals are one of those teams that tends to grab players that fall for whatever reason. So I don't see what the issue is, because these are the things that kind of happen. But more importantly, simulations are, I think, really good and cool because they allow people to participate in the process in a way that is quick and accessible and forces them to continue to make the kinds of decisions a general manager would make and make them think in ways that a general manager has to think. So, for example, the Vikings' primary need is probably at guard, right? They can maybe manufacture something at defensive tackle. They do have some worries at depth along tight end, but the primary need is probably guard, right? If you draft a guard round one, your other needs may not be addressed later in the draft because as the simulation progresses, there's a lot of defensive tackles off the board. And so by the time you pick at pick 50, you've got some guards available to you, but you don't have any defensive tackles. Maybe it would have been smarter to draft. And that's why I've been doing in my mock draft, drafting a defensive tackle and then a guard. So maybe it would have been smarter to draft a defensive tackle and then a guard, right? And it's very difficult to like think of that in the abstract, but it's very easy to understand it after you do the simulation like 30 times, right? And you get a good feel for the draft. And simulations are exactly why I thought the Vikings made a mistake drafting a cornerback in round one, because I didn't think those guards were going to be there at pick 60, whatever, where the Vikings drafted tackle Brian O'Neill. Because I thought those guards were going to go at the bottom of round one, top of round two. Guess what told me that? Draft simulators. And that's exactly how the draft played out. They're a really great tool, and for the tool to work, they need to have variance, they need to have unpredictability, they need to have, the likelihood that a player that's ranked, 13 is going to get drafted before a player ranked 5. That happens literally all the time. And so you need to have that kind of variance. You need to have a team that needs a defensive lineman draft the third-ranked defensive lineman instead of the first one every single time. You have to program variance and pseudo randomness into the simulators. And sometimes it can create like maybe some quirky results. I haven't seen stuff that's too quirky, honestly, because like Rock Ya-Sin is not universally considered a top 32 talent. There's a lot of people who I respect that have him outside their top 40. Fine. So that actually is not that quirky to me. But sometimes you'll have quirky stuff. Like I was able to draft Garrett Bradbury in the mock that I posted at The Athletic. I could have drafted Garrett Bradbury, who's like a top 25 player. I could have drafted him at 50. I didn't because, I think he's center only and stuff like that. And maybe, if I had given another go, I probably would have. But, that's kind of weird and quirky, and you don't expect that to happen. But that's fine because that's how the draft works. And every time you do this simulation, something different, unexpected is going to happen because it's unexpected, but at least it's something different. And you have to, as a general manager, respond to those changing conditions. And I think that is a great thing. It's a good thing. It's another way to interact with sports. And I think it allows fans to understand a little bit, at least, how much more difficult it is to be a general manager, because it's really tough to do this kind of stuff. And being able to do it again and again and again, I think gives you kind of an understanding of how tough it is. Plus, like, give these guys a break. This shit is hard to code. Like, it's like not easy, man. Give them a break. I mean, not everyone can write a 7-round mock draft every day. And it helps me as a writer, obviously, do it. But if, it's not because I'm lazy. I think it makes my writing more realistic because I could just say, hey, this player is ranked, generally speaking, 15th to 20th across a bunch of boards, I'm going to draft him. But maybe he's actually just not going to be available to you to draft. And so I have to explain my thought process, which I do in my piece. I explain the thought process of why I drafted these players where I drafted them, not just because of who they are as players, but because of the consideration I have for how the draft is going and how I expect the draft to go. And so that makes, I think, the writing more realistic. It makes it, I think, a little bit better. Plus, it makes my decisions a little bit more difficult because maybe there's a guy that I think will fall all the way to 50 and he just doesn't. Well, I can't draft him. In a normal mock draft for a team, I can just say, hey, I drafted him. It was pretty easy. But in a simulation-oriented mock draft write-up, you can't do that. You have to do it the same. And I could probably reload it like 18 times, but that sucks. So I'm just going to use the mock draft simulator and make a bunch of tough choices and explain my thinking. And if Dalton Risner falls to the 3rd round, great. I'm going to draft him and talk about that. But like, honestly, I don't see why this is a problem because I don't think it makes anyone's job more difficult as a draft analyst. It certainly makes my job more interesting. But as a draft analyst, I think that it can inform your writing in really interesting and unique ways. So I say just embrace it, and like the quirkiness is part of the process.
So last episode, it was the Love Fest at the right before the mailbag, and this episode, it is the Justify My Existence portion of the broadcast. So just wanted to get that out. Let's start at the mailbag. Kenneth Allen asks, what's your take on the Griffin restructure? Is it preferable to just cutting him and using that money to sign O-line or drafting a replacement?
Yeah, I think it is preferable to just cutting him because I think you've now got him at a point where he's going to create excess value. I think that now the Vikings are successfully underpaying him. That's the goal of any team, to underpay all their players so that they can have a super talented team. Think about it. Like if you've got 53 players who are all underpaid and you're at the cap ceiling, you've got an insanely talented team, right? So that's kind of your goal as a team. So I think it's a good thing. I think he'll overperform his cap hit this year. It's nice to have offensive linemen. I think it's even better to have players overperform. So overpaying an offensive lineman is probably not as good as, even if you've got a needed offensive line and less of a need along the defensive line, not as good as underpaying a defensive lineman. So I think that's a good thing. Plus, from a locker room perspective, I think it's really good that the Vikings are showing faith in him while still demonstrating that they do care about the value to the team overall. I think it's good that they kept a team captain. I think it's good that there's a support structure in place for him to stay at home. So there's a bunch of reasons, I think both personal and from a management standpoint, that make it smart.
Next question is from Raul, who says, I fear the Vikings will make a mistake by skipping offensive line in the first round. Which players are worth taking that risk? Ed Oliver, Christian Wilkins?
I don't think it would necessarily be a mistake. I think Wilkins is a good example of maybe that kind of player. I still don't know how the Vikings view him because he's a 315-pound tackle that played 3 technique, that passed the Vikings thresholds at nose tackle, but not at 3 technique. Now, I imagine if he drops the weight all the way to 300 pounds, he would. So I don't know, but I think he's a talented enough player to be that kind of player. Ed Oliver is that kind of player. It depends on what the Vikings think about Rashawn Gary, who's purportedly, immature, has an inconsistent motor, but he's an athletic, potential freak. But if they aren't worried about those red flags, he would be that kind of player. Obviously, Joey Bosa, Quinnen Williams, etc. Would be those kinds of players. But I don't think it's a mistake to draft a defender. And if they think that Jeffrey Simmons can play relatively early, just put him on the PUP list, and after 8 weeks, he'll be able to play. 8 weeks into the season, he'll be able to play. He would be that kind of player because he's a remarkably talented player, and of course, you have to check out his red flags too. But those are all players that I think make sense. I don't think a tight end is ever going to be, but I don't think you'll see a prospect as good as TJ Hawkinson in a while. I say that having thought that OJ Howard was a better prospect. So maybe we're just going to have these kind of generational tight end prospects every 2 years. Who knows? But I still don't think tight ends are worth that. And obviously, if Anthony Barr had not re-signed, one of the Devons, Devin White or Devin Bush, but I just think that it's very likely that there's going to be guards within striking distance of the second round. So I wouldn't freak out if the Vikings don't draft a guard in the first round.
Next question is going to be from Adam Goody, who says, what's your thoughts on the Vikings drafting DK Metcalf with the 18th overall pick?
It's not a great idea.
No, let's not.
Right, and I don't think he's a first round player, honestly. There's talk about him going top 5. He had a really interesting combine because he had just this really remarkable set of explosion and speed drills and just this really awful set of 3-cone and agility drills. The thing is, my data built off of now I think 12 years of testing tells me that for bigger receivers, if you're over 6'2", you're classified as a big receiver in this model, the 3-cone and the short shuttle don't matter. That's what it tells me. But the reason it tells me that is because all of the successful receivers who are bigger receivers, so the 15 most successful receivers, that ranges, from Julio and Calvin, all the way down to not all the way down because it's not very far down, but Alshon Jeffrey, right? Your Brandon Marshalls, and in the middle you've got your Des Bryant. So super successful big receivers, right? Guys you would not just spend a first round pick on, you might spend 2. Maybe not for Alshon Jeffrey, but the 15 most successful big receivers that I have killed every drill, which includes the agility drills. It's just more clear that the broad jump and vertical separated them from the rest of the pack in terms of big receivers than the 3-cone and the agility, but they killed every drill. And so it's very difficult for me to say that doesn't matter. It's also difficult for me to say that it does matter. My intuition is that it does, but I just don't know that. My model says it doesn't. So we'll see. But I mean, from what I've seen of his play, it's really good. It's second round stuff. So I would not draft him at 18, especially, given the Vikings need profile.
Yeah. Next up, Beef Brewski, who says, true or false, Vikings Twitter doesn't appreciate how huge of a loss Sheldon Richardson will be. Drafting a 3-technique tackle is a higher priority than getting an offensive lineman.
A little bit of both. I mean, I think the Vikings have more depth there. Well, they have depth there, so that's a start. And if the Vikings play Jaleel Johnson at 3-technique, they're in a better spot than if they play Danny Isadora and a clone of Danny Isadora at guard. So there is that.
Do we have that technology?
Hopefully not. But
could we use it on somebody other than Danny Isadora?
My understanding is no. It only works on Danny Isadora.
That's crap.
Right. But the difference in play, the difference in talent at 3 technique determines much more of games than the difference in play at guard. And I'm not completely sure why, but it might just be that offensive line play is very often, in terms of production, is a quarterback defensive line interaction more than a defensive line offensive line interaction, which is not to say they don't matter. They just matter a little bit less. So from that perspective, yes. I say probably the thing to think about it is that the Vikings have 3 needs: offensive guard, defensive tackle, offensive guard. And to argue that because it's offensive guard twice, that you need to draft one first, I think is just kind of missing the boat. You've got 3 needs. You should draft those needs if the talent kind of fits that. And I'm a big draft for need guy, but obviously don't reach too far. So, yeah. I don't know if it's a bigger need, but I very much sympathize with the argument that it is.
All right. Next question is also from Beef Brewski, who says, Jerick McKinnon was asked whether he'd considered returning to the Vikings, and his response was, quote, F no. I'll save the expletive there. How does this make you feel? Be sure to focus on your feelings.
Not even ambivalent. I don't know what I saw the Instagram comment that this came from. But I don't know what his context was. It could just be I love San Francisco a ton, or please stop asking me these kinds of questions. Or I hate the Vikings. I don't know. Didn't strike me as somebody who's particularly frustrated with the Vikings. So, I mean, in general, not in that comment, because that comment you could very much say, he was. But yeah, it doesn't make me feel bad. If players hate the team I write about / the team I cheer for, and they played for that team and they might have a legitimate grievance, that doesn't make me feel bad, right? Jeff Schwartz for a while really disliked how the Vikings treated him, which I thought was fair, by the way. But that did make me feel bad, right? If Teddy was man, I hate, the Vikings and how they treated me, I'd be that sucks, man. But that doesn't make me feel bad about the Vikings. It just makes me feel bad that Jerick or Teddy in this hypothetical, had to have that experience.
It does seem kind of odd, but at the same time, it's you're asking somebody who is in line to start next year if he'd be willing to come to Minnesota and be a backup again.
Right, there's that too.
Yeah, that's kind of how I took it. It was no, I think the F no was not about, forget about Minnesota. It was, I have this lined up here. There's no way I'm giving this up.
Right. Yeah, I think that's totally reasonable.
Yeah. Few people are more aware of the next man up than NFL football players. So this is a thing. There's no chance. The Thomas family tweeted out that the Star Tribune podcast said that the Vikes are actually pretty high on Norton, Collins, and Edison. Do they really mean this, or are they just blowing smoke to quell the O-line panic amongst Vikes fans?
So the Vikings are high on 3 of the 4 backups they have on the roster? Great. I hope they are. I don't know what that means. We think Storm Norton can start? Because if they think that, whoever thinks that should be fired. Man, he's bad.
They're high on him.
Right. Maybe they should talk to Rock Thomas about those feelings. No, but I think, Aviance Collins, fine. If he gains weight, maybe he can play guard. He'd be a super athletic guard. That'd be kind of cool. I could see them, being pretty happy with him. It's really unfortunate that he was injured throughout the year. Cornelius Edison, I'd be kind of surprised if they were super high on him. But yeah, I don't think it's the Star Tribune podcast's goal to quell panic among Vikings fans, because that's not their goal as journalists. So I don't think by saying that they were calm down, you don't have to worry. I think they're saying a thing that they've heard. Whether or not that thing that they've heard is a legitimate feeling that the Vikings have, either I don't believe it or it concerns me, right? Norton is not good. He is big. Edison is not that great. And in fact, they had him on the fourth string for a while in camp, so they can't have been too happy with what they saw, at least during training camp. Aviant Collins, that makes sense, and I was like way wrong on him coming out as an undrafted free agent. So, hopefully, he can play a significant role in a way that doesn't involve someone having to be horribly injured.
Hopefully. We can all hope. William Botke says, can you compare the skill sets of Jerick McKinnon and Amir Abdullah? Can the Vikings find similar production out of Abdullah next year that they got out of McKinnon in 2017?
I think McKinnon strangely has better vision and better ball security, which is like a really weird thing to say about a guy who played quarterback and has like the tiniest hands out of every running back in the NFL right now, which I think that's a fact. I don't think that's an exaggeration. But yeah, he's got better ball security, he's got better vision, and he's a much better athlete. Whether that makes him a better running back, there's other things that are part of that. But I think just generally speaking, he's demonstrated that he's a better running back. So I wouldn't say they're the same. He runs, he used to run worse routes. Now I would say he runs better routes than Abdullah. I would say not to expect similar production.
All right. Next question is from Don from Ohio, who starts off with, do you still think the Vikings will trade or cut a starter from last year?
Yeah, I think that they are trying to move Trey Waynes.
And finally, let's talk about the real reason we're all here. I'm sure Arif is very confident in his North Carolina Central Eagles to destroy NDSU. Who wouldn't be? How does he like his team's chances against Duke?
As a lifelong fan of NCC, the Eags, as they're called, I'm very confident in their men's basketball team to beat NDSU, who even knows what kind of school they are, who knows how good they are at basketball. I really expect a lot out of NCC, and Duke. I guess Zion's back, so that's going to be tough. But North Carolina showed that you can still neutralize Zion Williamson when he's healthy, and North Carolina Central is basically North Carolina, so I could see it. Yeah, they could beat Duke.
I was sticking up for you on Twitter the other day. I wanted to just have people remember just how much of a humanitarian you are when it comes to your North Carolina Central Eagles, and how much you truly believe in them, and how you've been a lifelong fan of them. I mean, we've talked
traveling
about
to North Carolina every week to see them has been difficult, but
it's put strains on your relationship, strains on your family.
But you have to focus on what's important, and that's my Eags.
It's about time somebody does. Jo says backup quarterback predictions.
Sounds like they want Simeon back.
Yeah, and Simeon's is looking at the Jets. Like, really?
Wait, really?
Yeah.
Oh my God. Incredible.
This is when you're constantly doing the free agent dance with the Jets. I'm starting to question our place in the league.
Right. Well, I mean, normally I'd just be like, well, if you win every time, it doesn't really count. But the Vikings just lost one. So we'll see.
You're like, it's going to be Kyle Sloter. Let's just move on. Eddie asks, with Johnny Manziel now a member of the AAF, this feels like an appropriate NFL scenario. What would the Vikings look like right now if they had successfully outbidded the Browns at 22 and drafted him in 2014?
They would be probably proud owners of Baker Mayfield. So I guess even better. They should have drafted Johnny, it turns out.
As it turns out, we should have just gone with Johnny Football instead of going with Teddy Bridgewater and being happy for 2 years.
Yeah, whoops.
Our bad. We should have just been miserable. Not that we're not miserable now, mind you. I'm not trying to,
You're right, yeah, but it should have just been with an opportunity for hope instead.
Yeah, I'm not trying to discount the misery here or something. So that's a fun phrase. I like that. Also, Arif has successfully dismantled the myth that Rick doesn't spend enough capital on O-line, but now it's pretty clear they should be drafting a couple linemen. What do you think of the claim he is a poor O-line scouter, and should we be worried about his picks?
Well, I mean, a lot of times you lean on the position coaches for that, but I think generally speaking, kind of, yeah. I mean, yeah, I guess he's pretty bad at acquiring offensive linemen. I think part of it is circumstance. Again, this is why I think the simulations are good, because it's very difficult to like get an understanding of what it's like to be a GM in a lot of contexts. But I think the Remmer signing was like good. He's just not a good guard, right? Brown O'Neill is a good tackle, right? Or at least so far. Riley Reef is an average tackle. They only slightly overpaid for him. Well, I guess we'll see about Elfline. It doesn't look like he's playing very well. Joe Berger, pretty good pickup. So in that context, like he's actually scouted all right. But in the context of like manipulating the draft to find that guard, a thing that he's normally good at, I guess not. He's had a lower than typical pick rate failure in the middle of the late rounds for guards, and that's been a strategy they've used to rely on a lot. But I wouldn't say, for example, that Brandon Flesko was a bad pick. He not just outperformed his pick slot, but before his pectoral tear injury, he was playing as like a top 10 guard. So there's reason to believe that while he may be a below average scouter of the offensive line, he is not like an abysmally bad offensive line scouter or anything like that.
Next question is from Kevin Sayer in the UK. Says, I've seen mixed opinions for Barr. I know this makes the cap crazy tight, but I fail to see how this isn't a good thing. Whomever we draft is not going to be better than him right now. Do you agree that even having his presence on the line of scrimmage pre-snap allows us to do so much as the opposing line and quarterback are not clear on what he or what others are going to be able to do? His athleticism allows different looks. If we were to get rid of him and draft someone else, we wouldn't have those options.
Mostly I already said a lot of that. I will say that I think Devin White and Devin Bush do actually have a lot of similar athletic traits. They're not quite 250 pounds like Barr is. So in that sense, he's still a unicorn. But I do think that they might be able to do some of the same stuff, especially Devin Bush. It is. It would be very, very difficult to replace him. I don't think it's a bad thing. I think that it puts more cap pressure on it than it should. But there you go.
Kyle Slaby asks, how much property damage did Big Mono cause during his recent trip to the cities? A lot more than you would have imagined, especially with that picture, that piece of art falling at the hotel. In the lawless land of Philadelphia, does Sendejo's aggressiveness increase to the point where he literally explodes upon impact with a wide receiver sometime next year?
Well, I mean, he might not even play because he's a third safety, but yeah, I mean, I would say that possibility is on the board.
It seems like the logical conclusion to this. It seems like the logical conclusion to this saga. Also, what record would the Vikings have this year if all NFL teams were transformed into the literal embodiment of their mascot?
So that's this upcoming schedule, right?
Yes.
All right. So we've got the Bears. Let's presume that the Vikings have their traditional weapons. The Bears probably win. Lions, if it's one Viking against one Lion, that's kind of interesting. But I would say if you can beat a bear, you can probably beat a lion. Packers, that's just a reference to the meatpacking industry in Wisconsin all the way back. So obviously, Eagle, yeah, the Vikings had arrows. Not touching Washington. Raiders, that's interesting. I would say they're the same thing, so tie. Horse, the Broncos, yeah, that's a horse. Falcons, yeah. Bears, Packers, Lions, already went over that. Giants, probably not. You're probably losing to Giants. Cowboys have guns, so probably lose to that. But if no one has weapons, you would take losses to the Bears and the Lions, but you would take a win against the Cowboys. Chargers, I assume that's a credit card, so you do pretty well against that unless you saddle the Vikings with debt. Then
power
in the
plant?
long run, they lose.
It might just be like a power plant.
Yeah, you could probably beat up a power plant. You just have to be really careful about it.
When is a Viking like clinical in the way that he?
Right. Chiefs, maybe that's probably a draw. Seahawks, they don't exist, so that's a win.
Speaking as an expert Seattle Seahawks blogger, let me assure you that this mascot does not actually exist. He's a lot like the Zubaz of Brian. Oh God, what's his name? Oh, he played for the Seahawks, and now I can't think of his name. The Boz.
Oh, yeah, Brian Bosworth.
Yeah, exactly. None of these things ever happened.
Right.
No photographic evidence at all. So that is going to be it for this episode. Arif, would you like to plug your article again?
Yeah, I did a 7-round mock draft. I included trades. I only selected players that met the Vikings thresholds as far as I could surmise, which left me with 99 players to select from. And I followed a lot of their tendencies. So that includes always drafting a late-round linebacker. That includes always drafting an edge rusher somewhere, whether or not it's in the middle or the late rounds. And I tried to address as many positions as possible. I even got to tight end depth, which was nice. So you can find that at The Athletic. I'll also be including it in the show notes.
And he's also been doing chats, so you can take a look at that as well at theathletic.com. I did have to ask you during the chat if you were more surprised the Vikings didn't pick up a kicker with such an unfortunate name that the Bears picked up. So, like, wow, that really just fits. I am kind of shocked that the Vikings didn't end up getting a kicker named Blewett. Like, really?
It would have been maybe too on the nose. Like, someone would have been like, God, you can't write reality like this.
No, it's just like the picture from the hotel falling. Like, no one would have believed it.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, it's like Rick Spielman jumped to the phone and went, no, this cannot be. Not this time. So that is going to be it for this episode of Norse Code. We hope you've enjoyed it. We'll be back in 2 weeks, so please remember to tweet that, even if it is a work in progress. Norse Code is the largest and only division of Norse Code LLC. You can find Norse Code on the Daily Norseman, SB Nation's Vikings blog at dailynorseman.com. You can also find it on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever fine podcasts are aggregated. Our Vikings blogger extraordinaire and generally useful human is Arif Hassan, and he can be found on Twitter at Arif Hassan NFL. I am your producer and co-host, and my name is James Pagashnik. You can find me at the show's official Twitter feed at NorseCodeDN. If you'd like to donate a few bucks to the show, you can make your one-time donation at paypal.me/NorseCode, or a recurring monthly contribution can be made by visiting patreon.com/NorseCode. Any questions or comments that won't fit in a tweet can also be sent to norsecodepodcast@gmail.com. On behalf of the Norse Code staff, we thank you so much for listening.
Our formula is this. We go out, we hit people in the mouth.